I was always deeply drawn to anatomy, and I genuinely wanted to be useful to sick people. Therefore, I enrolled in a prestigious medical school in Boston, Massachusetts. This chilling incident happened during my first year of studies, back in the 90s. As medical students, we regularly had practical classes in the university's old underground morgue. We participated in autopsies, practiced dissection, and assisted the senior doctors. On one of those long, exhausting days, toward the late evening, our practical classes finally came to an end. The professor left, and all the students, as usual, headed to the locker room showers attached to the morgue to wash off the heavy, clinging stench of formaldehyde. That evening, I stayed behind a little late. I was putting away my instruments and went to the showers when the rest of the students had already left. I spent about 15 minutes getting cleaned up, changed into my everyday clothes, and headed for the exit. To get to the main stairwell, my path required me to walk back through the large dissection hall. It was a long, freezing room where sheet-covered cadavers lay on the metal tables prepared for tomorrow's examinations. I quickly walked past the silent bodies, trying not to look at them. I reached the heavy metal door leading to the main corridor and pushed down on the handle. It didn't budge. I yanked it harder, but it was locked from the outside. The security guard must have assumed the basement was completely empty and locked everything down for the night. For some time, I aggressively tortured the door handle. Then I started knocking loudly and kicking the heavy metal with my boots. But the old door didn't even flinch. Time passed, and it was getting very late. I pressed my ear against the cold steel, but there were absolutely no sounds, footsteps, or signs of human presence outside. I didn't have a cell phone to call for help, especially since it was the 90s. Panic began to creep into my mind. How could they forget about me? I started screaming, hoping someone on the upper floors would hear me. After losing my voice, I finally realized with horror that there were no living people left in the building, just me and these covered bodies. I tried to calm myself down, deciding I would just have to endure this night and wait for the morning shift. But suddenly, with loud electric click, the industrial fluorescent lights on the ceiling shut off. The building's automatic timer had triggered. The massive hall was plunged into pitch-black darkness. The only source of light now was the faint, eerie greenish glow from the emergency exit sign above the locked door. The thick darkness made the freezing hall feel absolutely suffocating. Finally, accepting my fate, I huddled into the far corner of the room, pulling my knees tightly to my chest. I closed my eyes, deciding to simply kill time by sleeping. The morgue was unnaturally quiet. I had just begun to doze off when the faint sound sliced through the silence. I tensed up, my eyes snapping open in the dark. It sounded like a soft rustle of fabric. I stared into the gloom, my heart racing, but I couldn't see anything moving. I took a deep breath and began to rationalize the fear away. It's just an old building settling, I told myself. It's a ventilation system, or just my sleep-deprived brain playing cruel tricks on me. I waited in tense silence for another 5 minutes. When nothing else happened, the heavy blanket of exhaustion finally took over. I convinced myself it was just a hallucination, rested my head on my knees, and slowly drifted back into a light, uneasy sleep. But I wasn't asleep for long. A sudden, much louder noise jolted me awake. This time, there was absolutely no denying it. It wasn't the building, and it wasn't the wind. It was the distinct sound of heavy plastic sliding against the wet metal. It came directly from one of the autopsy tables in the center of the room. My breathing completely stopped. I peered into the green-lit gloom, my heart beating so hard my ribs physically ached. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed movement. The thick white sheet covering one of the bodies slowly, jerkily slid off the edge and fell onto the floor. I covered my mouth with both hands to keep from screaming out loud. The silhouette of a grown man was slowly sitting up on the stainless steel table. His movements were incredibly stiff and mechanical, as if he was fighting through deep rigor mortis. There was a sickening, wet crunch of popping joints in the silent room. Then, the corpse slowly swung its rigid legs over the edge of the table and slid down. Its bare, dead feet touched the cold tiled floor with a heavy, wet slap. He stood there for a few seconds, swaying slightly, trying to find his balance, and then the absolute most terrifying thing I could have ever imagined happened. Out of all the vast, dark space in that massive hole, he noticed me cowering in the corner. He slowly turned his head directly toward me. What I saw in the faint, sickly green emergency light was permanently burned into my brain. He had no eyes, just black, gaping eye sockets staring directly into my soul. His pale, stiff jaw was moving up and down, opening and closing silently, as if he was trying to say something to me from beyond the grave. An animalistic, paralyzing fear pinned me entirely to the wall. I blinked hard, praying desperately that it was just a severe sleep paralysis, a horrific, vivid nightmare that I would wake up from. But when I opened my tear-filled eyes, the creature took its first, clumsy, dragging step right toward me. He was walking, swinging his arms awkwardly, close in the distance. My survival instinct finally broke the paralyzing spell. I jumped to my feet, let out the loudest, most primal scream of my entire life, and bolted for the heavy metal door. I began pounding on it frantically with both fists, smashing my knuckles against the steel until they bled, sobbing wildly and begging for anyone to help me. I looked over my shoulder in pure panic. The corpse was only a few feet away from me now. Its long, gray, decaying arms were reaching out for my face. The empty eye sockets locked onto mine. Its ice-cold fingers were mere inches away from touching my skin. I squeezed my eyes shut tightly, crying, fully expecting the absolute end. And in that exact terrifying second, the heavy door behind my back crashed wide open. I fell backward into the brightly lit corridor, collapsing right into the arms of the startled night watchman. He had heard my desperate screaming during his routine patrol. The bright beam of his powerful flashlight cut deeply through the darkness of the anatomy lab. I looked back over his shoulder in absolute terror, but the hall was completely empty. There were no standing silhouettes. All of the dead bodies were lying peacefully on their steel tables, tightly and perfectly covered with their white plastic sheets. I spent the rest of the night in the security booth, shivering violently under the warm blanket and drinking liters of hot tea. When I hysterically told the old watchman what I saw, he didn't look surprised at all. He just nodded silently and smirked grimly, as if it wasn't the first time he had heard such a horrifying thing. Despite that living nightmare, I didn't quit medicine. I became a doctor, but since that night, I never, under any circumstances, stay alone in dark rooms. This story didn't happen to me, but when it was told to me, I didn't doubt its truth for a second. In the summer of 2009, I went to visit my grandmother in the remote mountain town in Appalachia, West Virginia. The kind of place where self-service dies and everyone knows everyone's business. There, through a lucky coincidence, I met a great local girl named Chloe. Chloe had an older brother named Luke. He was built like a brick outhouse, a real mountain man. At first, he glared at me like a wolf, and there were even a few threats, but eventually, we found common ground. Luke turned out to be a normal guy, and one fine day, we agreed to go fishing together at the local lake. The sun was beating down relentlessly. The fish were biting reluctantly, and the mosquitoes were eating us alive. Thank God Luke brought along a cure for the sweltering boredom. A large mason jar of strong homemade local moonshine. We quickly finished it off, the liquid burning our throats. After that, we kind of stopped caring about the fish, and we started chatting about everything. Suddenly, Luke became very serious. His gaze darkened, and he told me a story that happened to him before he ever met me. Luke had a childhood friend named Tommy. The two of them were inseparable back in the day. They often visited abandoned forest cabins miles off the main road, looking for old coins, antique bottles, or copper wire to scrap for cash. One dead of night, fueled by boredom and cheap beer, they decided to explore an old, rotting, uninhabited house that was located deep in the woods. They approached the house and pulled the front door. It was locked. They walked around the house and saw a window that had been ripped out along with its frame. The guys climbed inside through it. Inside the house, the air was thick with dust and the smell of rot. Everything was turned upside down. Dirty, mildewed sheets were scattered across the floor. A rusted iron bed was flipped over, and the heavy wooden table was broken in half. While they were sifting through the trash in the pale beams of their flashlights, they suddenly started hearing some noise from outside. At first, they thought it was a wild dog or a coyote, but they still decided to lay low and turn off the lights. Luke told me that for some reason, at that exact moment, a chilling fear pierced his soul. The noise outside wouldn't stop. In the absolute suffocating silence of the Appalachian night, you could clearly hear thick, dry branches snapping loudly under someone's feet. And suddenly, it dawned on Luke. A dog or a coyote cannot be that heavy. Whatever was walking outside was massive, and it was walking on two legs. The footsteps were slow, heavy, and deliberate, pacing back and forth in front of the porch. At that very moment, Luke became truly terrified. His mouth went completely dry, and his heart started hammering against his ribs. Then Luke noticed his friend. Tommy was standing motionless, staring at a single spot, and his face was completely contorted with unspeakable terror. Luke slowly turned his head at the exact same spot. He froze, staring right at them through the empty, shattered window with the massive god's face. It wasn't just an animal. It was too high off the ground, hunched over broad, humanoid shoulders. Its face was pale, covered in filthy, matted fur that reeked of copper and wet earth. But the worst part was the eyes. Human eyes, but with horizontal pupils gleaming with a sickly, intelligent malice. Running out of the house was terrifying because that thing was standing right outside the only exit. They just stood frozen in the dark, trapped, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, the god's face slowly lowered down and disappeared into the shadows. Dead silence fell over the woods. Tommy and Luke continued to stand like statues, afraid to even breathe. About 5 minutes passed. Nothing happened. They nervously started to think that everything was fine and the creature had left. But suddenly, from outside, right next to the closed front door, someone yelled. It was a macabre, distorted voice. It sounded like a vocal cord trying to mimic a human, but it was pitched wrong, vibrating in a demonic register.
Open the door, or it's going to be worse.
Right after those words, something started slamming into the old wooden door. The blows were of such inhuman, explosive strength that the entire cabin shook, dust falling from the ceiling. Tommy went into full hysterics. He dropped his flashlight and started sobbing uncontrollably, covering his ears. After about the third massive blow, the rusted lock gave out. The door violently smashed wide open. Luke didn't wait for that thing to step into the room. Beside himself with primal fear, he sprinted toward the broken window. He vaulted through the splintered frame and landed hard on the muddy ground outside. And in that exact second, he heard a heart-rending, agonizing scream from Tommy echoing out of the pitch-black cabin. A wet, tearing sound followed. At this point of the story, Luke's voice cracked and his hands were shaking so badly he had to put his drink down. I swear tears welled up in his eyes. Luke ran. How he made it home through the dense pitch-black woods, he couldn't remember himself. Branches whipped his face, tearing his skin, but he didn't stop once. He lay in his bed the entire night, paralyzed, without closing his eyes. Morning finally came. Someone knocked aggressively on Luke's door. It was Tommy's mother. She was in panic. She said that her son came home near dawn, barely alive. His hair, which had been dark brown the day before, had turned completely stark white. When asked what happened, he just mumbled incoherently, stared at his hands, and shook violently. She looked Luke dead in the eyes and asked the question, "Do you know what happened to him out there?" And Luke lied. He swallowed his guilt, said he had no idea, and claimed he had basically sat at home alone all night. From that very day, Tommy completely withdrew into his own mind. He stopped talking, stopped eating, and stopped communicating with anyone, including his own mother. He just stared blankly at the wall, rocking back and forth. A week later, he was taken to the psychiatric asylum, and they keep him there to this day, heavily medicated in the locked ward. The only person in the world besides me that Luke ever dared to tell this story to was his sister Chloe. And thank God she was one of those rare girls who knows how to keep a dark secret. I was the second, and most likely the absolute last person Luke told this horrific truth to, because exactly 2 weeks after our conversation on that lake, Luke died in a horrific, fatal motorcycle crash on an empty night highway. They say he swerved off the cliff like he was trying to avoid something standing in the middle of the road. Why he told this story specifically to me, a city guy he had only known for a couple of weeks, I don't know. Probably it was just eating away at his soul. The guilt was gnawing him alive from the inside. He needed to confess it to someone, because if he told his local friends, they would have killed him for abandoning Tommy in that cabin, and the whole town would panic knowing what roams in their woods. Luke knew I was leaving soon and wouldn't tell anyone. To believe in the God-man or not to believe, that is a personal choice for everyone. But looking into Luke's haunted eyes that day, I believed it all. Back in the 19th century, it was customary in Ireland to make coffins with holes through which a long copper pipe with a bell on the top end was inserted. The pipe allowed people who had been mistakenly pronounced dead and buried alive to breathe, and using a string and the bell, they could signal the cemetery groundskeeper. One day, Harold, an old undertaker in a small town, hearing the desperate ringing of the bell in the dead of night, went to check if it was once again the cruel pranks of local children. Sometimes the bells rang due to strong winds, but not this time. The door by the tombstone was shifting. A breaking female voice from below, from under the ground, begged Harold to dig up the grave immediately. "Are you Sarah O'Bannon?" Harold asked cautiously, kneeling down. "Yes," answered a muffled, panicked voice through the pipe. "Were you born on September 17, 1827? "Yes, please." The tombstone says you died on February 20, 1857. No, I'm alive. A horrible mistake has been made. Please, dig me up. I can't breathe. I'm sorry, ma'am, Harold said, kicking the bell and breaking it off, then kicking heavy dirt into the copper pipe. It is August now, and whatever the hell you are down there, you are sure as hell not alive anymore, and you are not getting out. The suffocating summer heat was making an already hopeless situation completely unbearable. I had been wandering through the dense forest for over an hour, and the cold realization was sinking in. I had completely lost my way back. There was absolutely zero signal on my phone, not a single bar. Any attempts to listen through the thick canopy of leaves, hoping to catch the distant hum of the interstate, were completely useless. There was nothing but the heavy, oppressive silence of the deep woods. Why did I come out here alone? I cursed myself out loud. I had decided to go off trail just to snap a few cool photos of untouched nature, and this was the result. I had wandered so deep into the woods that every single tree started looking exactly the same. I didn't pack survival gear for this. In my backpack, I had exactly 2 protein bars and a half-empty bottle of warm water. That would keep me going for the next few hours, but what about after that? I forced my way through the thick underbrush, stepping over sleek, mossy roots and trying desperately not to twist an ankle on the hidden rocks. I knew for a fact that nobody was coming to look for me. My few friends were out of town. Everyone had scattered for summer vacations. I was stuck in the city alone, too broke to travel. I was entirely on my own. Search and rescue wouldn't even start looking for me for days, probably not until I failed to show up for work on Monday. Dusk started to settle in. The shadows from the massive trees grew longer, turning the forest into a dark, confusing maze. I realized that walking in the pitch black was a death silence. I'd end up breaking my neck in the hidden ravine. I needed to build a shelter for the night. Thank God there weren't many large predators in this part of the woods. I decided to construct a crude lean-to shelter out of the fallen branches and a heavy pine bough. Scavenging for the right branches took another 2 hours. By the time I finished assembling my pathetic little hut, the sun had completely dipped below the horizon. The forest plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. I tossed my backpack into the shelter and was just about to crawl in after it when I suddenly froze. Off in the distance, cutting through the dense trunks of the trees, I saw lights. They were 3 dim, glowing orange orbs. They emitted a soft, warm, almost pulsating light. 2 of them were hovering perfectly still, while the third one was slowly moving in the mesmerizing circular pattern. To this day, I still don't understand why my survival instincts completely shut down at that moment. Why didn't I just stay inside my safe, dry shelter? Instead, moving like I was under some kind of spell, I took a step away from my camp and walked toward the lights in the dark. I kept walking and walking, but the lights weren't getting any closer. It felt like with every step I took, they retreated by the exact same distance, luring me deeper into that thicket. I quickly discarded the comforting illusion that it might be a ranger's cabin. I stopped, suddenly realizing the massive mistake I had just made. I turned around and realized I had completely lost sight of my shelter. I was standing in the middle of nowhere, without my backpack, without water, in pitch darkness. Panic slammed into my chest. My heart started hammering. My breathing turned into shallow gasps. Just to my left, a heavy branch snapped loudly. I flinched and instinctively looked back at the glowing orange lights, and as soon as my eyes focused on their soft, warm glow, the panic simply evaporated. My body felt incredibly light. My mind clouded over with a thick, comforting fog. Something was whispering directly into my brain. It is safe there. It's warm. There are people there. They will help you. On rubbery legs, I stumbled toward them. I didn't even notice that the number of lights was multiplying. There were dozens of them now. They were bobbing rhythmically in the dark, and now they were moving toward me. Have you ever seen how deep-sea angelfish hunt? It is terrifyingly brilliant. At the very bottom of the ocean, when there is nothing but crushing absolute darkness, this fish has a flashy appendage on its head that glows, a bioluminescent lure. Smaller fish see this beautiful warm light in the abyss. They swim toward it, feeling drawn to the safety of the glow, and when they swim just close enough, massive jaws filled with hundreds of needle-like teeth snapshot from the darkness. I pushed through the dense bushes until I stumbled into a small clearing. The glowing orbs were right in front of me, almost at arm's length, and then all the lights turned off at the exact same time. The trance broke. My mind snapped back to reality in a split second. I realized I could finally run, but it was far too late. In the dim, pale light of the moon, I finally saw what was standing all around me. They weren't human. They were creatures. There were at least a dozen of them. They looked like massive, grotesque black leeches, but with long, spindly, multi-jointed arms and legs. They started closing the circle around me. An atrocious stench hit my nose. The smell of rotten meat mixed with burnt rubber. My stomach violently lurched. They moved with a wet, disgusting sound. A few of them flickered their orange lights back on, illuminating their faceless, slimy, glistening bodies. Hot tears of absolute terror streamed down my cheeks. Realizing I had absolutely nothing left to lose, I let out a feral scream and charged directly through their horde. I shoved through them with my shoulders. The second I touched their slimy skin, I felt a searing, agonizing pain like burning acid. Their long, clawed hands shredded my sweater, desperately trying to drag me back into the darkness. 3 branches wiped across my face, tearing my skin and drawing blood, but I didn't stop. I ran completely blind through the woods, and they didn't fall back. Right behind my neck, I could hear a sound like a wet hand rubbing violently against thick rubber, and that wet squelching. Suddenly, the ground vanished beneath my feet. I tripped and tumbled violently down a steep, rocky slope, crashing through thorns and slamming into boulders until everything finally went black. I woke up late the next morning. The bright sun was blinding my eyes. I was lying in a deep drainage ditch, and just a few yards away, cars were zooming by on a paved interstate. I had survived. Tumbling down that steep drop-off had saved my life. They didn't follow me down to the asphalt. I was covered in mud and dried blood. Across my arms, neck, and back were horrific, corrosive chemical burns from where they had grabbed me. I limped onto the shoulder of the road and hitched a ride to the nearest town. Going back into those woods to find my backpack wasn't even an option in my mind. After that, I spent a lot of time with a therapist. Of course, he didn't believe a word of it, blaming the entire thing on extreme stress, dehydration hallucinations, and toxic plant exposure. I went through rehab, and eventually my life mostly returned to normal, but that night still lives in my head. I frequently wake up in a cold sweat, swearing I can hear that wet squelching sound in my bedroom. If you're listening to this story right now, I want to give you one piece of advice. If you ever find yourself out in the woods at night, for whatever reason, and suddenly off in the distance, cutting through the trees, you see a soft, pulsating orange light, look away, close your eyes, and run in the exact opposite direction as fast as your legs can carry you, because I know for a fact they are still out there, waiting. One young girl was riding home late at night in an almost empty subway car. Then she noticed that a woman sitting opposite her was staring intently at her, not taking her eyes off her at all. On either side of the woman sat two gloomy old men pressing closely. After a while, this blank, unblinking stare began to seriously disturb the girl. The woman didn't take her eyes off her for a second, and her head swayed slightly to the rhythm of the train. At the next station, a tall man in a coat entered the car. The woman opposite didn't even glance at him. When the train screeched to a halt once again, the man stood up to exit and suddenly grabbed the girl sharply by the arm and nimbly pulled her out onto the platform behind him. The car doors slammed shut immediately, and the train drove off into the darkness of the tunnel. The girl started screaming at him in fear, but the man let go of her arm and simply said, "Calm down, I just saved your life. I simply couldn't leave you alone in that car. The woman sitting opposite you was dead, and those two men were just propping her body up." Some time ago, I had to take a job as a night attendant at an old county morgue in a quiet Pennsylvania town. In itself, it was an easy job, a 24-hour shift followed by 3 days of rest. Plus, as people in our profession like to joke, the clientele here was exceptionally cooperative. At first, of course, I was terrified as hell and disgusted to be around the dead bodies in the basement. But after a couple of weeks, the human psyche adapts, and I got completely used to the constant sterile cold and the heavy stench of formaldehyde. On one cold autumn day, I clocked in for my regular shift. Toward the evening, old Mitch showed up in the office. This man had worked in this specific morgue for probably over 20 years, knowing every dark corner. He walked up to my desk, looked me straight in the eyes, and said in the very quiet voice, "Son, tonight, lock yourself inside in the night office with a deadbolt, and no matter what you hear, no matter what happens outside, do not dare to open that door. Tonight is the very bad night. All sorts of things can come here." Hearing this, I couldn't hold back. My intellectual arrogance took over, and I literally snapped. I hit old Mitch with every rude epithet and mockery I could think of. It felt deeply insulting to me that an uneducated night watchman was trying to scare me, a man with a prestigious university degree, with some stupid children's ghost stories. Mitch listened to my tirade silently, his expression unchanged. He just signed and said quietly, "As you wish, I warned you." Then he turned around and walked away into the darkness of the corridor. By the end of the day, I probably wouldn't have even remembered this ridiculous incident, but one detail subconsciously alarmed me. Mitch was completely sober, and his face was frighteningly serious. Usually he loved to drink and joked constantly, but not this time. Late in the evening, Dr. Andrews, our senior pathologist, stayed late at the morgue to talk with me about complex philosophical topics. We sat in the small night office, drinking strong coffee and arguing about life after death. But that detail, the sober, somber Mitch, just wouldn't leave my head, causing a strange sense of discomfort. Finally, closer to midnight, my companion said goodbye, and left. I locked the heavy external entrance door of the building behind him and was left entirely alone in the whole complex. I did my mandatory rounds. I checked the cooling units, made sure everything was in order in the autopsy rooms, turned off the main lights, and returned to my night office. Our morgue had the following layout. Right past the entrance door was my office, and from it stretched a long T-shaped corridor. At the very end of this hallway were the heavy metal doors leading to the main cold storage and the dissection rooms. Throughout the night, only a few dim emergency lamps burned in that T-shaped corridor. In the night office itself, the light was also supposed to be on according to the rules, but I turned it off to catch some sleep. All the internal doors in the morgue were never locked with a key. They were just tightly closed. On my office door, there was an old iron latch, but we always left this door wide open. It was exactly the same on that ominous night. It was unnaturally quiet. Not a breath of wind outside, no noise from passing cars. I sat at the desk, lazily reading an old book, but every now and then I involuntarily listened to the creepy silence. Around midnight, I started to feel very drowsy, and I decided to lie down on the leather couch. And at that exact second, I clearly heard the heavy door of the cold storage room creak at the very end of the corridor. Carefully, almost silently, but it opened. I slowly peeked out of the night office into the hallway. The space was flooded with the dim, scattered light of the lamps. Where the morgue doors were, it was solid darkness, and it was impossible to make out anything. I felt extremely uneasy. Trying to calm my frayed nerves, I thought it was just a draft from the ventilation system. I decided to go and check why the door had opened. To give myself confidence, I stepped deliberately hard, and my footsteps echoed in the hollow, heavy rhythm of the tiled floor. And then I felt with my sixth sense, ahead, in the depth of the black corridor, some barely perceptible wet movement. Mitch's words instantly flashed in my brain. Lock yourself in and don't come out no matter what happens. A freezing sweat broke out over me. I began slowly, step by step, back into the night office. I burst inside, slammed the door with a wild force, and sharply flipped the iron latch. In that exact moment, the rustle of fast, heavy bare footsteps rushed down the T-shaped corridor. They stopped right outside my door. For a moment, silence reigned, and then, from the outside, someone forcefully, violently yanked the metal door handle. The door gave way by a few millimeters, but the old latch wouldn't let it go any further. In the narrow gap, an indistinct, massive dark silhouette flickered, and a sickeningly sweet smell of decomposition instantly leaked into the night office. I screamed in terror, squeezed my eyes shut, and with wild strength gripped the door handle with both hands from my side. From the corridor, something horrific and maddening was persistently trying to break inside to get to me. It stretched the wooden door furiously, jerked the handle up and down, and chaotically fumbled with long fingers along the frames and walls. And all this madness happened in complete, dead silence. Not a single gasp nor heavy human breathing could be heard from behind the door. Only the suffocating smell of death and old formaldehyde poured from the gap. Together with the first rays of dawn, a dead silence finally fell over the corridor. No one was stretching the walls anymore. No one was forcing their way into my night office. But for a very long time, I physically could not open my hands and let go of the door handle. I just stood there, pressed against the wood, clutching the metal with my fingers, which had turned white from the wild tension. A persistent, loud ring of the intercom buzzed me back to reality and forced me to open the latch. The corridor looked completely normal and was empty. Because of this, for a second, it seemed to me that everything that happened at night was just a wild nightmare dream of an exhausted mind. The iron lock, as always, jammed badly, and it took me a long time to open it with my trembling hands. Finally, I succeeded. My relief shift worker was standing on a porch. "Man, you're a heavy sleeper, buddy. I've been ringing for an hour," he exclaimed, stepping inside. I instantly mumbled something about secretly drinking too much medical alcohol during the night, not hearing anything, and that basically it was best not to bother me today. The day was already in full swing, but I still couldn't bring myself to go home. I nervously smoked one cigarette after another on the porch of the staff entrance, desperately trying to convince myself that the nightly horror was just a hallucination. Dr. Andrews was standing next to me. He was cheerfully asking me about something. I answered him mechanically, while in my head only one obsessive thought was pounding. It was a dream. This simply cannot be real. Just then, a pale young intern quickly stepped out onto the porch. He was breathing heavily. "Dr. Andrews, we have a very strange, inexplicable case here," he said excitedly. "I was just preparing the corpse of that drowned man on the autopsy table, the one the police brought in from the river 2 days ago. Well, his fingernails are packed full of old white paint. And what's so strange about that?" Dr. Andrews exhaled lazily, ash flipping from his cigarette. "The guy could have been painting a fence or a boat before he fell into the water." "Yes, sir, the paint is indeed dried and old," the intern swallowed, his voice trembling. But the thing is, all those deep cracks and tears on the corpse's fingernails, they are fresh and they are absolutely post-mortem. He was clawing at something with his hands well after his heart had stopped beating. They walked back into the autopsy room, arguing loudly, while I slowly dropped my cigarette and walked down the T-shaped corridor toward the door of my night office. I stepped closer. At a human's chest height, on the perfectly smooth, white-painted wooden surface of my door, fresh, deep semicircular scratches and jagged torn gouges from human fingernails stood out clearly.